The story begins in a village called Stankiewicze, in the Nowogródek region of what is now western Belarus, then under German occupation. The Bielski family, David and Bela Bielski and their 12 children, were farmers. They ran a mill. They were one of a handful of Jewish families in the village, and by pre-war standards, a prosperous one. The older sons, Tuvia, Asael, Zuz and Aron, had grown up in the forest, knew it by instinct, and were known locally as resourceful, stubborn men. In December 1941, the Germans liquidated the Nowogródek ghetto. Tuvia and Asael Bielski's parents, a brother, and a sister were shot in the massacre. The brothers had not been in the ghetto when it happened. They were alive and they were alone and they had a choice to make. They went into the forest. At first they were 13 people, the brothers, other family members, a few friends who had also escaped the ghetto and found their way to the forest. They had almost no weapons, almost no food, and almost no plan beyond the most basic one: stay alive. Tuvia made a rule immediately. It was not the rule that the Soviet partisan command wanted to hear, and it was not the rule that maximized their operational effectiveness as a fighting unit, and it would create friction for every year of their existence in the forest. The rule was simple: every Jew who reaches us will be taken in. Men, women, elderly, children, the sick, the very young. Everyone. The Soviet partisan movement wanted fighting units. They wanted healthy men aged 18 to 40 who could carry a rifle and conduct raids. They did not want what the Bielski otriad, the Bielski unit, was becoming: a mobile community that prioritized survival of civilians over military efficiency. The tension was permanent and sometimes violent. Some Soviet partisan commanders attempted to disarm the Bielski group. One tried to have Tuvia killed. But Tuvia was not without leverage. He had weapons his group had seized or obtained. His unit conducted raids that produced real military results, and he had a capacity for negotiation under threat that his enemies consistently underestimated. He kept the rule. The Bielski otriad grew through 1942 and 1943 in ways that required constant improvisation. As more people arrived, survivors from liquidated ghettos, families who had escaped German roundups, individuals who had been hiding in barns and cellars and had heard somehow that there was a forest camp that would take them, Tuvia built something that looked less and less like a partisan unit and more like a functioning village. They built a tannery. They built a bakery, a mill to grind grain, a metalworking shop that repaired weapons and tools, a school for the children, a medical clinic with a nurse and, eventually, a doctor who had escaped from Nowogródek. They had tailors and cobblers and a watch repairman. They had a blacksmith. They had a small synagogue and Shabbat was observed. This was not incidental. Tuvia insisted on it. He understood, and this was a kind of strategic genius that did not come from military training but from something older, that people in the forest needed reasons to believe they were going to survive. A school is not a luxury when children are dying of despair. A bakery is not inefficiency when the smell of bread is the difference between hope and abandonment. 1,000 people in a forest need structure to survive. The Bielski otriad had a kitchen, a bakery, a mill, a tannery, a cobbler's workshop, and a carpentry shop. Doctors operated. A dentist pulled teeth. Teachers ran a school for the children. People were married in the forest, and children were born there. On evenings when the security situation permitted, a small orchestra played. It was, as one historian would later describe it, a civilization in the trees. His brother Zuz led the combat operations. He was harder than Tuvia, more direct, sometimes brutal. He conducted raids on German supply lines, attacked collaborators, and maintained the external security of the camp with a ferocity that the German commanders and the local police came to take very seriously. Asael commanded the camp's internal order and the training of new fighters. He was quieter than either of his brothers, methodical, deeply trusted by the people in the otriad. The forest could hide a small group. It was much harder to hide 1,200 people. By 1944, the otriad had grown to the point where concealment required constant movement and elaborate precautions. They moved camp more than once to stay ahead of German search operations. They maintained scouts on the perimeter at all times. They had a network of informants in the surrounding villages, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who provided intelligence about German movements. In late 1943 and into 1944, the Germans mounted a serious effort to destroy the partisan groups in the Naliboki forest. Operation Hermann, as it was designated, involved significant German forces sweeping through the forest. The Bielski otriad survived it by dispersing, moving in small groups through pre-planned routes, and reassembling deeper in the forest. 1,236 people came out of the forest when the Soviet army pushed through in July 1944. The exact number is in the records. Nekametek, who wrote the definitive academic history of the otriad, conducted interviews with survivors decades later and cross-referenced their accounts with German documentation and Soviet records. 1,236. Tuvia Bielski saved more Jews than Oskar Schindler. What happened to the brothers after the war is not the triumphant ending that a film would write. Tuvia and Zuz emigrated to Israel in 1945 and fought in Israel's War of Independence in 1948. They then immigrated to New York. Tuvia started a trucking company. Zuz started a taxi business. They lived in Brooklyn. Tuvia drove a cab. He was, by multiple accounts, a difficult man in civilian life, commanding, accustomed to absolute authority, not well suited to ordinary middle-class anonymity. He was also, by those same accounts, a man who had lived at a level of responsibility and consequence that had no equivalent in peacetime. He died in 1987. He was buried in Israel. Asael Bielski had been killed on January 7, 1945, while serving with the Soviet Army. He had survived 4 years in the Naliboki forest, had seen the Soviet liberators arrive and the otriad dissolved, and had been conscripted or had volunteered into the Red Army for the final push into Germany. He died in East Prussia, 3 weeks after surviving everything the forest had thrown at him, 24 years after he had gone into it as a young man with nothing but his knowledge of trees. He was 33 years old. Aron, the youngest brother, became a businessman in the United States. He lived until 2008. He was the last surviving brother and the last direct link to what had been built in the forest. The film Defiance, released in 2008 with Daniel Craig as Tuvia, brought the story to a global audience that had mostly not heard of the Bielski brothers. The film took liberties, as films do. It compressed the timeline, simplified the politics, softened some of Tuvia's harder edges. But it did the one thing that mattered. It put the name in front of people who had never encountered it. Nekametek, whose 1993 book formed the basis of the film's research, said in interviews that she had been astonished, when she began her research in the late 1980s, to find that the Bielski otriad was almost entirely unknown outside of the survivor community. The survivors knew. Their children knew. But the story had not crossed into the general historical record. Part of the reason was the complexity. It was not a simple story of resistance. It involved friction with the Soviet partisan command, questions about the conduct of the otriad in surrounding villages, difficult decisions Tuvia made about food and weapons and authority that do not fit neatly into a simple heroic narrative. Tuvia himself said, when asked about it, "I would rather save one old Jewish woman than kill 10 German soldiers." He meant it as a statement of values, not strategy. As it turned out, it was also the decision that produced the more extraordinary outcome. In the Naliboki forest today, there is almost nothing left. The trees are old. The clearings where the camp stood have filled back in. The dugouts have collapsed. But in Jerusalem, at Yad Vashem, there is a record of 1,236 people who walked out of that forest because one stubborn farmer's son from a village that no longer exists refused to close the door. His rule never changed. Every Jew who reaches us will be taken in. In 4 years of forest, he never broke it once. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week.